Benny Hill was the most successful comedian the world has ever known. He was the lad from Southampton who did the rounds of the music halls and working men's clubs doing the jokes, and ended up being lauded by television audiences in 90 countries.
I called myself Benny because I admired Jack Benny so much.
The Benny Hill Show was a global hit until one infamous scene pushed things too far.
Your wife?
Would I have a maid as ugly as that?
What should have been comedy turned into scandal, sparking outrage, backlash, and whispers that TV executives were just waiting for the right moment to pull the plug.
The first thing that says, do you know Benny Hill? Not Mrs. Thatcher, not the Queen.
Well, I'm prettier, aren't I? Ain't it the truth?
Was it really about changing times, or was Benny set up for a fall? The truth is darker than fans ever realized. Have you ever noticed how some TV shows grip the entire world, millions glued to their screens, only to suddenly vanish without warning? The Benny Hill Show wasn't just funny, it was a cultural earthquake. For years, it thrived, with Benny's quick-fire gags and unforgettable sketches. But then, one scene changed everything. A sketch so shocking, so divisive, that instead of laughter, it triggered outrage. The same man who built his career on making people laugh suddenly became a villain in the eyes of the public. Stick around, because you're about to see the scene that destroyed a legend.
Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, all sorts of things like that.
For decades, The Benny Hill Show ruled television, pumping living rooms full of slapstick chaos, cheeky gags, and that instantly recognizable theme tune. Benny Hill himself became a household name, a clownish genius whose grin and antics pulled in millions of fans worldwide. But behind the laughter and the quick chase skits, a storm was gathering. One sketch, just one, would push things too far. What was meant to be another bit of harmless fun exploded into a cultural firestorm that critics say lit the fuse on Benny Hill's downfall. The joke wasn't just bad. It was a line crossed.
People have said, oh, Benny Hill doesn't belong to be on the television in today's day and age. You know, we have different values. He wasn't woke. It was sexist comedy. It was, he used to black up. Everything that the modern...
It was tasteless. It was crass. And it arrived at a moment when society had simply run out of patience with Hill's brand of comedy. The year was the late 1980s. The Benny Hill Show had long flirted with controversy, but this time the backlash was different. A parody beauty pageant sketch reduced women to props, ogled and paraded for cheap laughs, capped off with a gag that even some loyal fans found indefensible. What had once been brushed off as cheeky British humor was now seen as ugly, outdated, and offensive. Television tastes were shifting, and so was the culture. What people once laughed at, they now condemned. That one sketch didn't just spark complaints, it ignited the debate that would drag the show to its knees. How did a program loved by millions, a comedy empire, collapse so spectacularly? What really happened to Benny Hill's empire of laughter?
Like the live stuff, do you, or do you?
I don't do live stuff, or very seldom. No, I prefer television. That's my sort of, my meat.
Before we uncover the sketch that changed television history, we need to understand the man at the center of it all, Benny Hill himself. Alfred Hawthorne Hill, better known as Benny Hill, entered the world on January 21st, 1924. Or was it 1925? Even something as basic as his birth year carries a cloud of uncertainty. Some records say 1924, others 1925, and Benny himself never seemed bothered by the mix-up. But was this simply a clerical error? Or was it the first hint of a man who enjoyed bending the truth, even about himself? His father, Alfred, ran a surgical appliance shop, practical, straight-laced, and far removed from the spotlight. Yet the Hill family bloodline pulsed with performance. His grandfather, Henry Hill, had been a circus clown, the sort of figure who thrived on attention. Benny inherited more from Henry than from his own father. It was as if he was destined to sidestep the mundane respectability his father chose, chasing instead the risky, chaotic glow of show business.
What is the difference between a vitamin and a hormone? Thought you'd have got that one. You can't make a vitamin.
But Benny's climb didn't start with applause. As a young man, he shuffled through ordinary jobs: stockboy at Woolworths, milkman, truck driver, drummer. At first glance, those years looked unremarkable, but critics have since argued that these jobs exposed him to the lives of ordinary working-class Britons, people he would later turn into the butt of his jokes. What some called relatable comedy often carried a cruel edge. Was Benny celebrating the working man or mocking him from the stage? His first step into entertainment was backstage, not center stage. As an assistant stage manager, Benny learned timing, precision, and the importance of keeping an audience hooked. But here's where the first cracks appeared. Some who worked with him in those years recalled Benny as painfully shy, even awkward off stage, yet ambitious to a fault. Was this shy young man simply biding his time, quietly plotting how to turn every lesson into his own spotlight moment?
I met Jim Davidson, a fine comedian and a gentleman. Had drinks with all three of them.
Then came the war. In 1942, Benny Hill put on a uniform and joined the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Officially, he was a mechanic. Unofficially, he became a jack of all trades, driving trucks, fixing engines, operating searchlights. By 1944, he was in Normandy, right in the thick of the European campaign. Now, here's where history gets messy. Some accounts paint him as a loyal soldier, a cog in the war machine who did his part, but others hint that Benny wasn't cut out for military life. He complained, ducked responsibilities when he could, and seemed far more interested in entertaining his mates than following orders. Some even whisper that his transfer to different duties wasn't about versatility at all. It was the army quietly moving a troublesome recruit around. Was Benny Hill the dutiful soldier history books claim, or was he the joker in uniform, already showing signs that rules and discipline were never his strong suit? What's certain is that those war years hardened him. The timing he learned, keeping searchlights sweeping at the exact second to expose enemy bombers, was the same kind of precision he later used for comedic chase scenes.
Hopeless nations turn in times of trouble, said his dad. When one nation all alone decides it can do nothing, son, that's when the United Nations meet and decide that nothing can be done.
Before the fame, the scandals, and the slapstick that made him a household name, Benny Hill was already a paradox, a man with a clown in his bloodline, a soldier who may have hated soldiering, and an ambitious outsider quietly preparing to turn his odd jobs and war scars into a career. The world would remember him as a comedian. But beneath the laughter, Benny Hill's origin story was laced with contradictions, ambition, and controversy. A man who never fit neatly into the roles handed to him, and perhaps never wanted to. Before the war even ended, Benny Hill made a move that would change the course of his life. He transferred into the Combined Services Entertainment Division, Britain's effort to keep morale alive among soldiers by bringing them comedians, singers, and entertainers. Here, under pressure and in front of restless troops, Hill found the perfect training ground. He learned how to hold an audience, how to keep their attention when the jokes risked falling flat, and how to master the timing that would later define his television empire. This wasn't just practice, it was survival comedy. And it worked. Hill discovered his rhythm, his delivery, and the power of slipping humor into any situation. His inspiration came from the larger-than-life comedians of Britain's music hall tradition. These weren't safe, polite entertainers. They were bold, loud, and unforgettable, filling theaters with songs, gags, and risque humor. Hill soaked it up, but it was one American comedian who left the deepest mark, Jack Benny. With his dry wit and razor-sharp timing, Benny became Hill's idol. In tribute, Alfred Hawthorne Hill dropped his given name and rebranded himself forever, Benny Hill.
Is it Benjamin? I never did find...
My name is Alfred Hawthorne Hill.
Alfred Hawthorne Hill?
And I called myself Benny because I admired Jack Benny so much.
Armed with his new identity, his wartime experience, and a hunger to perform, Hill launched himself into show business. His first real break came through the airwaves. On October 5th, 1947, he landed a spot on Variety Bandbox, one of radio's most important comedy showcases. The response was immediate. Listeners were hooked by his quick wit and the way he could mold his humor to any situation. But radio was only the beginning. The world was about to fall in love with television, and Benny Hill was ready. By 1950, he made his first TV appearance, suddenly able to use not just his voice, but his body, his expressions, and his gift for slapstick. His comedy wasn't just about jokes anymore. It was about sight gags, exaggerated movements, and timing so sharp it bordered on cartoonish. In 1962, he pushed further with Benny Hill, a sitcom anthology where he reinvented himself every episode. One week he was a bumbling everyman, the next a pompous snob. The format proved what insiders were starting to realize. Benny Hill could become anyone, anytime.
Things from abroad written on the white piece of paper that contains the shirt. When it comes back from the laundry, you tear the cellophane off and there's enough there for a sketch.
And then, in 1964, he shocked critics by stepping into Shakespeare. Cast as Bottom in a star-studded TV production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, Hill merged slapstick with classical theater, and to the surprise of many, pulled it off. He wasn't just a clown, he was a performer with range. But Benny always returned to satire. Between 1964 and 1966, Benny Hill Time hit BBC Radio Light program, where he unleashed biting parodies of pop culture. His Bond spoof From Moscow with Love skewered the spy craze, while his send-ups of the Beatles and other icons cemented him as both relevant and daring. By the mid-1960s, Benny Hill wasn't just another comedian. He was carving out a brand of humor that was bigger, bolder, and more controversial than anyone else on the airwaves. And soon, television would give him the global stage he needed to turn that brand into a phenomenon. In Benny Hill Time, listeners were introduced to a revolving door of oddball characters who would become staples of his comedy arsenal. There was Harry Hill, the bumbling everyman who always seemed a step behind life, and Fred Scuttle, the bizarre, mumbling figure whose crooked walk and mangled speech were instantly recognizable. These recurring personas weren't just filler, they were the seeds of a universe Benny Hill was building, one character at a time. And yet, success didn't come easily. On stage, Hill struggled. For every sketch that landed, there were nights where audiences simply didn't connect. The critics weren't always kind either, branding him as inconsistent, sometimes brilliant, sometimes forgettable. The stage was unforgiving, and it seemed Hill's larger-than-life style needed something more than a spotlight and a live crowd. Radio, too, was a mixed bag. Though he had flashes of brilliance, his shows could swing from smash hits to duds, and Benny never quite cemented himself as a star in that medium. But these failures weren't wasted, they were battle scars, the kind of trial and error grind that sharpened his instincts and gave him the resilience he'd need for what was coming next. Because the truth is, Benny Hill wasn't made for the stage, or even for radio. His brand of humor needed visuals, the pratfalls, the leering expressions, the fast chases, and outrageous sight gags. And when television arrived, Benny Hill found his perfect weapon.
The writing of a show, I always have, I don't now because I'm being interviewed, but I normally have a pocket here or somewhere with a pencil and a piece of paper.
On January 15th, 1955, The Benny Hill Show premiered on the BBC. What happened next would change British comedy forever. Hill drew straight from the music hall tradition, slapstick, parody, innuendo, and fused it with the power of TV production. Live sketches collided with pre-recorded sequences, allowing Hill to experiment with pacing, effects, and timing like never before. The formula was explosive. Audiences were hooked from the start. To some, he was a breath of fresh air. Bold, unfiltered, and gleefully outrageous. To others, he was already treading on dangerous ground, blurring the line between cheeky fun and outright vulgarity. But one thing was certain. Television had finally given Benny Hill the stage big enough to match his ambition. Benny Hill may have been the face of the show, but his comedic empire was never built alone. During his BBC years, a rotating cast of collaborators gave life to his sketches. Patricia Hayes, Jeremy Hawk, Peter Vernon, Ronnie Brody, all of them cycled through Hill's slapstick circus, helping him craft the bizarre, fast-paced world audiences came to love.
You're on your own to write. You cannot write if you're in a crowd of people.
Behind the scenes, co-writer Dave Freeman was just as vital. Through the 1950s and into the early 60s, Freeman shaped much of Hill's material, sharpening his gags and giving structure to the chaos. But no collaborator became more beloved than Jackie Wright, the tiny, bald-headed Irishman whose deadpan face and perfect timing made him the ideal victim for Hill's infamous head slaps. Time and again, Wright would take the smack, sit there stone-faced, and let the audience erupt with laughter. That silent partnership became one of the show's most enduring trademarks. Still, Hill wasn't chained to the BBC. Between 1957 and 1960, and again in 1967, he dabbled with ITV and ATV, testing different formats, reaching new audiences, and pushing his comedic identity further. These detours hinted at a restlessness, a need to stretch beyond the BBC's limits. Then came 1969, the turning point. The Benny Hill Show left the BBC for Thames Television, and everything changed. The show was no longer weekly filler. It became an event. 1-hour specials replaced the old format, giving Hill more time, more money, and more freedom to expand his world. Bigger sets, more elaborate musical numbers, more over-the-top sketches. Hill finally had the resources to match his ambition. The move catapulted the Benny Hill Show into its golden era. Audiences adored it, ratings soared, and Benny Hill's mischievous grin became a global symbol of British comedy. But with more freedom came bigger risks. The sketches got louder, brasher, and more outrageous. And while that made him a superstar, it also set the stage for the cultural backlash that would one day bring it all crashing down.
He was always the butt of the joke. The women were always elevated above him. He wasn't punching down at women. He was always the idiot, the gormless, hapless idiot.
Under Thames Television, the Benny Hill Show exploded in popularity. No longer just a British hit, but an international phenomenon. Broadcast in over 140 countries, Benny's brand of slapstick and innuendo needed no translation. His mugging faces, bumbling characters, and over-the-top chase scenes worked everywhere from Europe to Asia to the Americas. For a time, Benny Hill wasn't just a British comedian. He was the face of global comedy. Hill's success rested on his versatility. One sketch he'd be the hapless everyman. The next he'd be lampooning pompous authority figures with biting satire. He could flip from the underdog to the buffoon to the mock villain, all tied together with his gift for physical comedy. Behind it all was Hill himself, writing, shaping, and controlling the world he created. But occasionally, inspiration came from others. One example came in 1976, when cast member Cherry Gilham reportedly sold him her Fat Lady sketch idea. It appeared in the January 1977 episode, with Hill even writing to Gilham from Spain to confirm he'd be using it. But in keeping with the norms of the time, her contribution, like many others, went uncredited. Hill got the applause, others got silence. That's the part of his empire people don't like to talk about. Benny Hill, the comic genius, built his kingdom partly on the backs of uncredited performers and writers who never got their share of the spotlight.
It's not necessarily lonely, but you've got to be on your own to mull it over, work it out.
Real sound clip. Of course, no element of the Benny Hill Show became more famous than the runoff chase sequences. These chaotic finales, sped up through a trick called undercranking, turned simple gags into wild cartoonish spectacles. With Hill sprinting across parks, alleys, or studios, trailed by policemen, nurses, or scantily clad women, the scenes became his trademark. They were ridiculous, absurd, and unforgettable. Audiences loved them, critics loathed them. To some, the sped-up chases were comedy genius. To others, they were lazy, repetitive, and, by the late 70s, embarrassingly sexist. And here's the truth nobody wants to admit. Those chase scenes weren't just wacky fun. They were built on ogling, on stereotypes, on the same tired punchline, women as decoration and men as fools. It was comedy that punched down, not up. At the height of his fame, Hill was adored by millions across the globe. But the very formula that made him iconic, the slapstick, the stereotypes, the ogling, the endless chases, would in time be re-examined under a harsher spotlight. The world was changing, and Benny Hill, whether he realized it or not, was running headlong into controversy.
Stand watch over everything that goes on the telly. You know, for example, the ridiculous cancellation or the attempts to cancel virtual episodes of Faulty Towers recently. It's just ridiculous.
The so-called legendary chase scenes on the Benny Hill Show weren't just slapstick chaos, they were a bizarre carnival of stereotypes. Police officers, old grannies, church vicars, and half-dressed women all thrown together, running around to the same tune over and over again. That tune, of course, was Boots Randolph's Yakety Sax, which became so inseparable from Hill's brand of humor that people now just call it the Benny Hill theme. Sure, in 2015, ITV crowned it the #1 TV theme, but let's be real, that title says more about nostalgia than taste. By the 1980s, the show had doubled down on its most controversial gimmick, Hill's Angels. This troupe of glamorous young women was brought in to shake things up with dance routines and skimpy outfits. Fans thought it added sparkle. Critics called it window dressing. And they weren't wrong. Many of Hill's skits turned these women into props, accessories for his outdated punchlines. Sue Upton, one of the original Angels, became a familiar face thanks to her comedic timing. But it's hard to ignore that she was also tasked with making Hill's antics look less creepy. Even Jane Leeves, who later found real stardom as Daphne on Frasier, had to first play the part of eye candy under Hill's spotlight. Meanwhile, Hill leaned on his loyal ensemble, Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Jackie Wright, to keep the comedy rolling. But when that wasn't enough, he brought in kids. Dubbed Hill's Little Angels, many of them were children of cast and crew members like Sue Upton and director Dennis Kirkland. Family-friendly? Maybe. Opportunistic? Definitely. Nothing says playing it safe like dragging kids into a show increasingly criticized for objectification. Then there was Jenny Lee Wright, nicknamed the Stooge by Hill himself. She was popular for her ability to mix allure with slapstick, but the nickname tells you everything you need to know. For all the laughs, the show was built on one man's obsession with turning women into punchlines, costumes, or ornaments. And here's where the controversy sharpens. Benny Hill's comedy didn't just age badly. It became a cultural sticking point. Defenders say it was a different time, or dismiss it as harmless fun. But was it? Or was the Benny Hill Show really a blueprint for outdated, chauvinistic humor disguised as classic British television? The uncomfortable truth is that Hill's empire was built on three things: uncredited labor, cheap stereotypes, and a constant parade of objectified women. For years, that formula made him untouchable. But when society finally began asking harder questions about sex, representation, and accountability, Benny Hill's comedy suddenly didn't look like harmless mischief anymore. It looked like a fossil. And that's the real legacy of the Benny Hill Show. Not just the laughs, but the controversy. A reminder of how easily a nation can mistake exploitation for entertainment, and how fast a global icon can go from untouchable to outdated. Despite its global success, the Benny Hill Show was dogged by controversy. What fans laughed off as harmless innuendo, critics called blatant racism. By the 1980s, society was starting to ask whether Hill's comedy, built on leering at women, endless double entendres, and physical gags, wasn't just outdated, but actually harmful. And this wasn't just grumbling from a few critics. The pushback grew louder until even Thames Television, Hill's longtime backer, decided enough was enough. By 1989, the show was axed.
This thing about you being a recluse.
Oh, that's the newspapers, they say
Yeah,
that. It's ridiculous. I'll tell you. My diary. I'll show
You got a diary?
Recluse.
But here's the twist. Hill didn't just lose ratings. He was accused of something much darker. Alternative comedian Ben Elton, one of the era's rising voices, publicly branded The Benny Hill Show as more than tasteless. It was dangerous. Elton went on record in both Saturday Live and Q Magazine in 1987, accusing the program of fueling crimes against women. He argued that Hill's endless chase scenes and women as props sketches weren't just sexist stereotypes. They helped create a culture where women felt unsafe just walking down the street. That accusation cut deep. To some, Elton was exaggerating. To others, he was finally saying what no one dared to say out loud. Was the Benny Hill Show simply slapstick fun? Or was it normalizing predatory behavior under the banner of comedy? The debate tore through British television, and the cancellation of Hill's show became a turning point. Suddenly, comedy wasn't just about laughs, it was about responsibility. Hill's defenders still call him a comedy genius, but his critics insist he left behind something more toxic than timeless. Ben Elton's accusations against the Benny Hill Show didn't just criticize a comedian, they lit a cultural firestorm. Some saw Elton as a brave truth-teller. Others thought he went way too far. One writer for The Independent compared his crusade to watching an elderly uncle being kicked to death by young thugs. In other words, Hill might have been outdated, but did he really deserve to be painted as a societal villain?
Mr. Hill, what has television given you?
Well, nervous dyspepsia, indigestion, heartburn, All sorts of things like that, you know.
Supporters of Hill pushed back hard, insisting that blaming slapstick sketches for real-world was not just absurd, but dangerous. GQ magazine mocked Elton's logic, comparing it to blaming concert pianists for elephant poaching, an overblown, pompous stretch that made his crusade look more like self-promotion than serious critique. The irony? Elton himself eventually lampooned his own holier-than-thou persona. In Harry Enfield and Chums, he appeared as Benny Elton, a parody of a politically correct bore, only to be chased off-screen by furious women to the tune of yakety. The sketch highlighted just how divisive his attacks on Hill had become. Was he the voice of progress, or a humorless killjoy trying to censor comedy? Meanwhile, regulators began circling. A spokesman for the Broadcasting Standards Council admitted the landscape had shifted. What once passed as cheeky fun, like half-naked women running in circles for a punchline, was now being condemned as offensive and backward. What Elton started wasn't just a critique of Benny Hill. It was the opening shot in a culture war over comedy, censorship, and the blurry line between laughs and harm. For all the outrage and criticism, there's no denying one uncomfortable fact. The Benny Hill Show was a monster hit. At its peak in the early 1970s, over 21 million viewers tuned in. Numbers so huge, they made it one of the most watched programs in British history. Clearly, millions of people weren't offended. They were laughing right along with him. And the industry didn't exactly shun him either. In 1972, Hill walked away with a BAFTA for Best Writer, proof that the same comedy branded decades later was once celebrated as groundbreaking. He even snagged a nomination for Best Entertainment Performance, confirming his rare ability to write, perform, and dominate an entire genre of TV comedy.
Benny Hill was the most successful comedian the world has ever known. He was the lad from Southampton who did the rounds of the music halls and working men's clubs doing the jokes, and ended up being lauded by television audiences in 90 countries.
By the late 1970s, Thames Television had successfully exported his formula to America. The Benny Hill Show went global, syndicated across U.S. networks, and suddenly Hill was being hailed as an international comedy icon. Emmy nominations followed in 1980 and 1981. Hardly the treatment of a man accused of destroying comedy's moral compass. Even Europe couldn't resist. In 1984, Hill was honored with the prestigious Rose d'Or Award, cementing his status as a comedy pioneer. That honor didn't just celebrate a man, it validated a style of humor that was already under fire for being outdated and offensive. So here's the paradox. Benny Hill was condemned as a cultural dinosaur, but he was also showered with awards, international fame, and industry recognition. His sketches, his characters, and that infamous yakety-sax became global shorthand for British comedy. The question that still divides people today, was Benny Hill a comedy genius unfairly canceled, or a relic of a era who got away with far too much success before the hammer finally fell? After more than 2 decades of raking in ratings and profits for Thames Television, Benny Hill's empire came crashing down in 1989. Officially, the network cited declining ratings and rising production costs as the reasons for canceling the Benny Hill Show. But many saw it differently. After earning Thames an estimated £26 million, Hill wasn't retired with honor. He was tossed aside. The numbers told their own story. Each episode cost around £450,000, the equivalent of over £1.4 million in today's money. Thames executives decided Hill's slapstick wasn't worth the price tag anymore, especially with advertisers backing away and audiences growing tired of recycled gags. To them, Benny Hill was no longer an asset. He was dead weight. For Hill, it was more than a cancellation. It was a public humiliation. After years as one of Britain's biggest exports, he found himself branded as outdated, expensive, and expendable. Instead of bowing out gracefully, he scrambled for relevance. In 1991, he launched Benny Hill's World Tour, a desperate attempt to reinvent himself by staging sketches in locations where he was still adored. It sounded ambitious, global comedy, filmed on the road, but only one special ever got made. Greetings from New York. The one-off featured old allies like Henry McGee, Bob Todd, and Sue Upton, trying to recapture the magic in a different setting. But the spark was gone. What should have been a triumphant comeback felt more like a swan song. The special was later packaged as Hill's final television appearance. A bittersweet reminder that Britain's one-time comedy king had been dethroned, exiled from the very stage he once ruled. In the end, Benny Hill didn't leave the Benny Hill Show on his own terms. He was pushed out, caught between shifting culture, brutal television economics, and his own refusal to evolve. In February 1992, Thames Television quietly re-aired re-edited episodes of The Benny Hill Show. It was a last-minute gesture to appease persistent viewer demand, but the timing was uncanny, coming just weeks before Hill's death. The reruns proved what executives didn't want to admit. Despite canceling him, Benny Hill still had an audience that refused to let him go. Yet behind the enduring fame and nostalgia, Hill's personal life painted a far bleaker picture. For all the millions he earned, Benny Hill lived like a man determined to vanish into the background. He never owned a home in London, instead renting modest flats, even after earning Thames Television £26 million. For 26 years, he lived in a cramped double room on Queen's Gate, later moving to Fairwater House in Teddington. To fans, it looked eccentric. To critics, it looked tragic. His frugality bordered on obsession. Hill was a millionaire, yet he bought cheap supermarket food, walked miles rather than hail a taxi, and only rode in limousines if someone else footed the bill. He wore patched-up clothes instead of replacing them, as if clinging to the austerity of his childhood long after he'd outgrown it. Some called it modesty. Others whispered it was paranoia, proof that behind the mask of slapstick, Benny Hill was a man too distrustful or too lonely to enjoy the fortune he had built. In the end, the world saw a comedy icon. But behind closed doors, Benny Hill lived like a recluse, his simple lifestyle raising uncomfortable questions. Was it humility, or the symptom of a man who spent his life making others laugh while failing to find joy for himself? For all the laughter he generated on screen, Benny Hill's private life told a different story, one marked by loneliness, rejection, and unanswered questions. He never married, never had children, and despite his wealth and fame, spent his final years largely alone. Twice in his life, he proposed marriage. Twice, he was turned down. Actress Annette Andre later admitted that she rejected Hill's proposal in the early 1960s, a revelation that only deepened the tragic image of a man adored by millions, yet unable to find love of his own. Hill's guarded personal life fueled relentless rumors about his sexuality. Whispers followed him for decades. Was Benny Hill secretly gay? He denied it whenever asked, but his refusal to discuss relationships only kept the speculation alive. With no clear answers, his silence became part of the mystery. Was he hiding something, or was he simply a man who never let the world in? By the late 1980s, Hill's once vibrant career was shadowed by failing health. He suffered a mild heart attack on February 24, 1992. Doctors recommended bypass surgery. He refused. Days later, kidney failure set in. Again, he rejected treatment. Some saw stubbornness, others saw a man who had quietly given up. On April 20th, 1992, at just 68, Benny Hill died alone in his Teddington flat, slumped in an armchair, the television still glowing. His body wasn't found until 2 days later, after unanswered calls raised alarm. The official cause, coronary thrombosis. The cruelest twist? A brand new TV contract from Central Independent Television arrived the very same day he passed, proof that the industry was finally ready to welcome him back just as his life ended. Hill was laid to rest in Southampton on April 28th, mourned by fans who saw him as a comedy legend. Financially, he left behind a fortune worth over £7.5 million, equivalent to nearly £20 million today. But his will, written 3 decades earlier, left most of it to his parents, both long dead by then. It was the ultimate irony. Benny Hill, a man who spent his life making the world laugh, died alone, unwed, childless, and with a fortune he never truly enjoyed. His final years raised the haunting question: was Benny Hill a comedy genius undone by changing times, or a lonely man who never managed to find happiness off-screen? As a result, Hill's estate was divided among his 7 nieces and nephews, proof that despite his fame and fortune, he still kept the family close in his final legacy. Even with the controversies and shifting tastes in comedy, Benny Hill's influence hasn't faded. In November 2021, That's TV announced that The Benny Hill Show would return as part of its Christmas schedule, the first nationwide broadcast of his work in nearly 20 years. Alongside other ITV classics like Beatles About and Kenny Everett's New Year specials, this revival proved just how much nostalgia and affection still surround Hill's comedy. Today, Benny Hill's style is studied and celebrated for the way he fused slapstick timing with clever writing, creating unforgettable characters and sketches that raise the bar for comedians around the world. Love him or criticize him, his mark on comedy is undeniable, and his laughter continues to echo across generations. That's it for today. See you in the next video. Until then, goodbye.